The canyon walls exploded with gunfire bullets, ricocheting off ancient stone in sharp cracks that echoed like breaking bones. Silas Crane pressed his back against the boulder, blood streaming hot down his left arm, sticky between his fingers. 6 violin down to none. The revolver in his hand clicked empty, a hollow sound that might as well have been a death sentence. Across the firelit clearing, Garrett Hollis stood with his weapon trained, steady, his face twisted into something between fury and disbelief. Behind him, 2 men moved through shadows flanking, cutting off every escape route that didn't exist anyway. The iron cage stood empty, 20 feet away, its door hanging open like a broken promise, like evidence of the choice that brought Silas to this moment. Garrett's voice cut through the gun smoke. All this for a savage woman. You threw your life away for nothing, Crane. Silas tasted copper and dust. His vision swam at the edges, blood loss pulling him toward darkness. But somewhere in the haze he found words. Not nothing. The knife felt heavy in his right hand, useless against bullets, but the only weapon left. Garrett advanced, boots crunching gravel, each step deliberate. Above them, stars wheeled in their ancient paths, indifferent to the small violence of men. Silas thought of her face in the moment she stepped through that open cage door. Free. That memory alone made the ledger balance, made the mathematics of survival irrelevant. Some prices were worth paying. Garrett raised his gun. The barrel looked enormous, a tunnel to oblivion. Silas closed his eyes and waited for the sound that would end everything. But what he heard instead was thunder. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses moving fast through the narrow canyon passage. Garrett's head snapped toward the sound, confusion, breaking his certainty for just a second. A voice boomed across the stone amphitheater, amplified and absolute. This is Marshal Webb. Drop your weapons, all of you. 4 days earlier, Silas woke to silence that felt wrong. The rooster should have crowed by now. Hens should have clucked their morning complaints. Cattle should have lowed from the near pasture. But the ranch lay quiet under dawn's first gray light. Quiet the way graveyards are quiet, the way abandoned places sound when life has given up trying. He swung his legs off the cot, feeling the protest in his back, the ache that came from sleeping on broken springs for months. Because a real mattress cost money he didn't have. The floor was cold. Everything was cold lately. He pulled on boots with holes in both soles, tied them from habit of more than hope. Through the window he could see what remained of his dream. Fence posts leaned at drunken angles, wires sagging between them like something defeated. The barn door hung crooked on one hinge. Weeds had claimed the vegetable patch Margaret once tended with such care, growing tall and defiant where tomatoes and squash used to thrive. 3 years of drought had broken this land, broken everyone trying to hold on to it. But drought was just a word for what happened when God stopped listening. Silas walked through the main room of the house, past furniture covered in dust sheets, past walls where photographs used to hang before he'd packed them away because looking hurt too much. The kitchen table held exactly 3 things: a tin coffee pot, a cracked mug, and a leather wallet worn smooth from years of use. He picked up the wallet, opened it, and counted what remained of his life. $23.18. 2 buttons that had fallen off his only good shirt. And tucked in the back fold, nearly transparent with age, a pressed leaf no bigger than his thumb. Brown and brittle, its edges crumbling, but he kept it anyway because Emma had given it to him when she was 6 years old, had pressed it into his palm and said it was for good luck, Papa, for when you need it most. He hadn't needed luck then. He'd needed it ever since. The photograph was there, too small and fading. Margaret smiled from 10 years past, her hand resting on Emma's shoulder, both of them squinting into sunshine that felt like it belonged to a different world. He didn't look at it long, couldn't. $23 wouldn't pay what he owed, wouldn't fix the fences or buy seed or hire help. Wouldn't do anything except delay the inevitable by maybe a week. The bank had given him deadlines before extensions stacked on extensions, but Mr. Pemberton's last letter had been clear. Final notice. 2 weeks or foreclosure. No exceptions, this time, no matter what Silas had once been or done. Good men don't pay debts. That's what Pemberton had told him last month, standing in this very kitchen, looking around at the decay like it was evidence of moral failure. War's been over for 15 years. Time to move on. As if moving on was something you decided to do, like saddling a horse or choosing which road to take. As if the past released its grip just because you asked politely. Silas poured water that tasted of rust and minerals into the coffee pot, set it on the stove, and waited for heat that came slowly because the wood was damp and the fire weak. While water refused to boil, he let his mind wander to places it shouldn't go. To Margaret's voice saying she believed in him. To Emma's laughter before everything broke. To the man he used to be before survival became the only thing that mattered. The coffee was bitter. Everything was bitter. Outside, the sun climbed higher, and with it came the sound he'd been dreading. Hoofbeats on the long drive, steady and purposeful. Silas didn't need to look to know who it was. Creditors have a particular rhythm, the sound of consequences arriving on schedule. He met Pemberton at the porch steps, not inviting him in, not offering courtesy that would be wasted anyway. The banker looked exactly as he always did, pressed suit, polished boots. Expression of professional regret that never quite reached his eyes. He carried a leather folder under one arm, the kind that held legal documents and broken dreams. "Mr. Crane," Silas said nothing, made Pemberton work for it. The banker cleared his throat, a sound like shuffling papers. "I assume you received my letter, the final notice." "I did." "Then you understand the situation. 2 weeks from today, if the outstanding balance isn't settled in full, the bank will be forced to execute foreclosure proceedings. This property will be auctioned to recover our losses." Silas felt something dark move through his chest. Not anger exactly, something colder. "Losses, that what you call it." Pemberton had the decency to look uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one polished boot to the other. "I know you were a good man once, Crane, a decorated soldier, a respected member of this community. But the bank deals in numbers, not sentiment. You've exhausted every extension we can offer. Good men don't pay debts. That what you said last time?" A flush crept up Pemberton's neck. "I said good intentions don't pay debts. There's a difference, is there?" The silence stretched between them, filled with heat and resentment and the weight of all the words neither man would say. Finally, Pemberton extracted a document from his folder, held it out. "This is the formal notice. Eviction date is marked. I'm sorry it came to this." Silas took the paper without looking at it. Pemberton turned to leave, then paused, glancing back over his shoulder. "For what it's worth, I served too. Different war, different uniform. But I know what it's like to come home and find nothing fits anymore. Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones we fight after the shooting stops." He rode away before Silas could decide whether to thank him or curse him. Either way, the paper in his hand felt heavier than it should, each word a nail in a coffin he'd been building for years. Inside, Silas poured another cup of bitter coffee and made a decision. He couldn't pay what he owed, couldn't save what was already lost. But he could try. One more time. One more attempt to claw back from the edge before gravity won for good. That meant work. Any work. The kind of work good men didn't ask questions about because questions had consequences, and consequences were a luxury for people with choices. By noon, Silas was riding toward town, the sun hammering down on his shoulders, the road shimmering with heat. His horse was old, nearly as broken as he was, but still game for a few more miles. They moved through landscape that had once seemed full of promise, back when he'd first claimed this land, back when Margaret was alive, and Emma still called him Papa, with something like pride in her voice. The town hadn't changed much. Same dusty main street, same weathered storefronts, same saloon with its faded paint and swinging doors that never quite closed properly. Men gathered there for news and whiskey and the kind of opportunities that didn't get advertised in newspapers. Men like Silas, desperate enough to stop asking questions they didn't want answered. He tied his horse outside and pushed through into dimness that smelled of tobacco and spilled liquor. A dozen heads registered him, then turned back to their business. Silas wasn't interesting anymore. Used to be, people remembered his name, what he'd done in the war, the medals he'd earned. Now he was just another failure trying to pretend otherwise. The bartender nodded acknowledgement, already reaching for the cheap whiskey Silas could almost afford. But Silas waved him off. "Just information. Heard there might be work." "What kind?" "The paying kind." Understanding flickered across the bartender's face. He jerked his head toward a corner table where 3 men sat playing cards, with the kind of focus that suggested the game mattered less than the conversation around it. One of them looked up, meeting Silas's eyes with an evaluation that felt physical, like hands searching for weaknesses. Garrett Hollis didn't look like a man who trafficked in human misery. He looked successful, confident. His coat was clean, his hands manicured, his bearing that of someone who made money and slept soundly afterward. When he gestured Silas over, the motion was almost friendly. Heard you asking about work. You Silas Crane? I am. Garrett Hollis, sit. Silas sat. The other two men at the table continued their card game, but their attention had shifted peripheral and watchful. Garrett studied him for a long moment the way a prospector might study more, deciding if it was worth the effort to extract. You were military, decorated soldier if I recall correctly. Fought in the Apache campaigns. That was a long time ago. But you know the territory. Know how to handle yourself in rough country. Might. Garrett smiled, an expression that suggested he appreciated directness. I have a business proposition. Simple job, 3 days of work, pays $200. Interested? $200. The number hit Silas like a punch. That was nearly what he needed. Not quite enough to settle everything with Pemberton, but enough to buy time, maybe renegotiate, maybe find a way forward that didn't end in eviction. What's the job? Security work. I need someone to watch over valuable cargo for 3 days. Just 3 days. Make sure nothing happens to it. Make sure it stays where I put it. Something in the phrasing made Silas pause. Cargo, not goods, not merchandise. Cargo, the word people used when they didn't want to be specific about what they were moving. He should have asked more questions. Should have demanded details, insisted on knowing exactly what he'd be guarding and why it needed guarding. But $200 was $200, and questions were complications that got between a man and his survival. Where canyon site about half a day's ride north. Remote location. Quiet. You'll have supplies, everything you need. Just watch the cargo for 3 days, then we move it and you get paid. Simple, banam. What kind of cargo needs armed guard in the middle of nowhere? Garrett's smile didn't waver, but something cooled behind his eyes. The kind that pays $200 for 3 days. That's all you need to know. The other men at the table had stopped pretending to play cards. One of them, thick-built with scarred knuckles, leaned back in his chair. Man's asking if you want the job or not. Simple question. Silas felt the weight of their attention, the pressure of the moment. Margaret's voice echoed in his memory. Something she'd said years ago about choices and consequences, about the kind of man he promised to be. But Margaret was dead, and promises were currency he could no longer afford. I'll take it. Garrett extended his hand and they shook. The deal was done. Silas had sold something without knowing its price, had agreed to terms he didn't understand, had taken the first step down a path he couldn't see clearly. But he had work. He had $200 waiting 3 days away. He had a chance. That was enough. It had to be. The ride north took longer than Garrett promised, but men like Garrett measured distance in convenience rather than accuracy. Silas followed the directions, following the canyon road as it wound through increasingly desolate terrain. The landscape here was beautiful in a hostile way, all stone and sky, and silence that felt older than memory. His mind drifted as the horse plodded forward, drifted to places he tried not to go. Margaret's face kept surfacing, unwanted and persistent, the way drowning things surface when the water finally releases them. He could see her smile, hear her voice, feel the particular warmth of her hand in his. Promise me, whatever happens, you'll stay good. That had been in the beginning, back when staying good seemed like the easiest promise in the world. Back when he believed in himself the way she believed in him, with a certainty that made faith look simple. The memory sharpened, became specific. 10 years ago, maybe 11. Evening light pouring gold through the kitchen windows. Emma on the floor playing with carved wooden animals he'd made for her 6th birthday. Margaret kneading bread dough flour, dusting her forearms, her hair escaping from its pins in ways that made his chest ache with contentment. He'd been talking about the future, about plans to expand the ranch, about the life they'd build together. Margaret had listened with that expression she wore when she was memorizing moments, storing them away like treasures. Then she'd turned serious, wiping flour on her apron, meeting his eyes with something that looked almost like fear. Promise me something, Silas. Promise me you'll never become like the men we left behind. The ones who survived the war but lost their souls in the process. I won't. Say it. Promise. I promise. Whatever happens, I'll stay good. I'll stay the man you see when you look at me. Emma had jumped up, then running to him with something clutched in her small fist. A leaf bright autumn red, perfect and whole. For good luck, Papa. Keep it forever, and you'll always be brave and good. He'd tucked it into his wallet, and she'd beamed with the pride of a child who believes their gifts have power. The memory released him, dropped him back into the present where the leaf was brittle and fading, where Margaret was 10 years dead, where Emma wouldn't speak to him, and good was a word that belonged to someone else. The promise had broken the way everything else broke slowly, and then all at once eroded by time and necessity, until nothing recognizable remained. The canyon entrance appeared ahead, a narrow gap between towering walls of layered stone. Silas urged his horse forward, feeling the temperature drop as shade swallowed them. His hand drifted to the revolver at his hip, checking its presence, confirming its reality. Whatever waited ahead, he'd face it armed and as ready as a broken man could be. The canyon opened into a natural amphitheater, walls rising on three sides like the audience of some ancient coliseum. A fire pit marked the center, cold ash suggesting recent occupation. And beside it, incongruous against the raw beauty of stone and sky, stood a cage. Iron bars 6 feet on each side, built sturdy enough to hold something dangerous. The door stood open, waiting. Beside it, 4 men lounged with the casual posture of people who did violence for money and slept soundly afterward. Garrett stood as Silas approached, his face breaking into that professional smile. Right on time. Good. Let me introduce my associates. He gestured to each man in turn. Price was the thick-built one from the saloon, the one with scarred knuckles and eyes that never quite settled. Cole stood apart, lean and quiet, the kind of man who killed efficiently and without conversation. And Daniel, younger than the others, with the uncertain bearing of someone still deciding what kind of man he'd become. You understand the assignment: 3 days watching the cage. My associates and I have business elsewhere. We'll return tomorrow evening to relocate our cargo. All you need to do is ensure it stays secure and breathing. Think you can manage that? Silas looked at the cage, at its solid construction, at the chain and padlock hanging from the door. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to build this, had hauled materials through difficult terrain, had planned and executed with the kind of precision that suggested experience. What exactly am I guarding? Garrett's smile acquired edges. A prisoner, a dangerous one. That's all you need to know. Dangerous how? Price laughed, a wet, ugly sound. Savage Apache woman. Cut a man for no good reason. Wild as they come. Something tightened in Silas's chest, but he kept his expression neutral. He'd learned a long time ago that showing interest in the details of a bond only invited complications, only opened doors to knowledge that became responsibility. Better to stay ignorant, to do the work without understanding its implications, to take the money and walk away clean. Except he'd never walked away clean. Not once. Garrett pulled a canteen and a sack of provisions from beside the cage, handed them over. Water's scarce out here. There's enough for both of you, but don't be generous. And Crane, his voice dropped lower, acquired intimacy. She doesn't speak English, so don't bother trying to talk to her. And even if she did, you wouldn't want to hear what she has to say. These Apache women have a way of getting into a man's head, turning things around, making you forget why you're here. Silas took the canteen without comment. He'd heard warnings like that before, usually from men trying to convince themselves as much as anyone else. Usually from men who knew what they were doing was wrong, but needed to justify it anyway, needed to paint their victims as threats, rather than people. Garrett and his men mounted their horses with practiced efficiency. Before they left, Garrett turned back one final time. One more thing. If she tries to run, if she tries to fight, you stop her. I don't care how, but she needs to be alive and unmarked when we get back. She's worth more that way. Worth more. The words hung in the air like smoke after the men rode out their horses, kicking up dust that drifted slowly back to earth. Silas stood alone in the canyon with an empty cage and a job he was already beginning to regret. The sun climbed higher. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals in lazy spirals. And Silas waited, trying not to think about what worth more meant in a place like this, trying not to wonder what kind of prisoner required this level of security and isolation. When he finally heard the sound of approaching horses, something in his chest tightened in a way he didn't recognize. An instinct, maybe. A warning his body understood before his mind caught up. 2 riders appeared through the narrow passage, leading a single horse between them. And mounted on that horse, hands bound in front of her head, held high despite everything, was a woman who would change the trajectory of Silas Crane's life in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. But he didn't know that yet. Price and Cole dragged her toward the cage with the rough efficiency of men moving cargo. But she walked with her spine straight and her chin level, refusing to stumble, even though her bound hands threw off her balance. 15 feet separated them, but Silas could see everything the midday sun revealed. The sharp angles of her cheekbones, the exhaustion around her eyes, the split in her lower lip where someone had struck her. But more than any of that, he saw something that made his stomach drop into cold certainty. She wasn't afraid, she was furious. Dark eyes locked onto his with an intensity that felt like a physical blow. She didn't plead, didn't crave him, simply stared at him with a look that said she saw exactly what he was: a man who traded his humanity for money, who guarded cages and called it work, who survived by refusing to witness the cost of his survival. Price laughed. "She's sizing you up, Crane, wondering if you're worth killing when she gets the chance." The woman stepped into the cage without being pushed. The door clanged shut behind her, the sound echoing off canyon walls like a death knell. The men locked it with a heavy chain and padlock, then tossed the key to Silas. He caught it reflexively, felt its weight in his palm like accusation. "Good luck. 3 days with that one's going to feel like 3 years." They mounted their horses and disappeared through the narrow canyon passage, leaving Silas alone with his prisoner. The silence that followed was profound. Even the hawk had stopped circling. Silas forced himself to move to do something practical. He checked the lock, confirmed it was secure. Walked the perimeter of the cage looking for weaknesses in the iron bars, even though he knew there weren't any. He was stalling. He knew it. She knew it. The knowledge hung between them like humidity before a storm. Finally, he had no choice but to acknowledge her presence. He approached the cage slowly, the key heavy in his pocket. She sat on the ground with her back against the far corner, bound hands resting in her lap, watching him with those same fierce eyes. The words came out rougher than intended. "I'm going to give you water." He uncorked the canteen and held it through the bars. She didn't move, didn't even blink. "You need to drink. It's going to get hotter." Still nothing. Just that stare, that judgment, that complete refusal to cooperate with the performance of his pretended humanity. In that moment, Silas felt the full weight of what he'd become. All the compromises he'd made, all the lines he'd crossed, all the times he'd told himself survival required ugly choices and honor was a luxury for people who didn't know real hunger or real desperation. But standing there with that canteen in his hand, offering water to a woman in a cage he was being paid to guard, Silas Crane felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time: shame. He set the canteen just inside the bars where she could reach it, then stepped back. Her eyes followed him. After a long moment, she spoke. Her voice was rough from thirst, but clear, and her English was better than Garrett had claimed. "You are not like them." 3 words shouldn't have carried so much weight. 3 words shouldn't have felt like accusation and observation and challenge all at once. Silas opened his mouth to respond, to say something, anything. But before he could find words, she continued, "But you will be. By the time they return, you will be exactly like them." The certainty in her voice was worse than any insult. She didn't sound angry or hopeful. She sounded like she was stating a simple fact about how the world worked, how men like Silas became men like Garrett, through small compromises and deliberate blindness. And the worst part was, until about 30 seconds ago, Silas would have agreed with her, would have nodded and accepted the assessment as accurate, as inevitable, as the price of staying alive in a world that didn't reward goodness. Now he wasn't so sure, and that terrified him more than anything Garrett or his men could do. The afternoon heat settled into the canyon like something elusive and suffocating. Silas sat in the shade of an overhanging rock 20 feet from the cage, trying to read the worn book he'd brought with him. Words blurred together. Every few minutes, his eyes drifted toward the woman. She'd finally taken the water, drinking it carefully, making it last. Now she sat with her eyes closed, breathing slow and measured. He wondered if she was sleeping or simply enduring. The sun angled lower, throwing long shadows across stone. Silas thought about the money waiting 3 days away, thought about Pemberton and foreclosure notices and the ruins of everything he'd tried to build, Thought about how easy it would be to just do the job and walk away to take the $200 and tell himself he'd done nothing wrong, had simply watched a cage for 72 hours, had simply survived. But that word kept circling back. Simply, as if anything was simple when you knew what you knew, had seen what you'd seen, understood the machinery of cruelty you'd become a cog in. Margaret's voice returned unwanted and persistent. You promised. Whatever happens, stay good. The promise he'd broken once already when she lay dying, and he'd chosen wrong when he'd taken money for work that turned out to be trafficking, rather than transport when he'd failed to save her, because he'd been too cowardly to intervene when intervention might have mattered. Emma's face surfaced next, not the 6-year-old who'd given him a lucky leaf, but the 18-year-old who'd looked at him with eyes full of betrayal and said, "You're not my father anymore. You're just a man who looks like him." The memories were knives, each one precise, each one finding spaces between ribs where old wounds never quite healed. Night was falling when Silas heard hoofbeats again, different from earlier. Just one horse moving carefully through the narrow passage. He stood hand-moving instinctively to his revolver, but recognized the silhouette before drawing. Daniel, the young one, riding alone without Price or Cole's company. The younger man dismounted with the uncertain movements of someone whose confidence had failed. He approached Silas, slowly glancing toward the cage where the woman sat motionless in gathering darkness. "I couldn't stay away. Needed to tell you something." The words came out flat, harder than intended. I don't want to know." "You should. You deserve to know what you're protecting." "I said I don't want to know." But Daniel continued anyway, words spilling out like confession. "Garrett didn't tell you the whole truth. That woman, they didn't just catch her. They slaughtered her family to get her. Children, elders, all of them. Burned the camp, killed anyone who resisted and most who didn't. She was trying to protect the children when they took her." The world tilted. Silas felt something cold move through his chest, spreading outward to his fingertips, turning his blood to ice water. "You're lying." "I wish I was. I was there. I saw it. That's why I left tonight. Can't carry it anymore. Can't pretend it was anything other than murder." Daniel's face looked haunted in the fading light, hollowed out by guilt. Price and the others, they tracked her family for weeks. Waited until the men were away hunting. Then they came in fast and hard. Said it was necessary, said she was too dangerous to take any other way. But I saw the children. Saw what they did. His voice cracked. "I'm riding out tonight. Getting as far from this as I can. You should too, while there's still time. While you can still pretend you didn't know." Daniel mounted his horse, then paused, looking back one last time. She was trying to save them. The children. That's what she did wrong. That's why she's here. Then he was gone, disappearing into darkness that seemed to swallow sound itself. Silas stood frozen, Daniel's words echoing in the sudden silence. Behind him he heard movement in the cage. Turned to find the woman standing gripping the bars, her eyes catching firelight. When she spoke, her voice was soft, but carried complete certainty. "He told you the truth, didn't he? Now you know what kind of men you work for." Silas couldn't answer, couldn't speak past the thickness in his throat. But something in his eyes must have confirmed it, because she nodded once slowly as if she'd expected nothing different. "Now comes your choice. Now you decide who you are." The night pressed close. Stars wheeled overhead in patterns older than sin. And Silas Crane stood at the edge of a decision that would cost him everything, or save what little remained of his soul. He didn't know yet which path he'd choose. Didn't know if the man Margaret had believed in still existed somewhere beneath the layers of compromise and survival. But the woman in the cage was watching, waiting, and time was running out for both of them. Dawn came without mercy. Light spilled across canyon walls in shades of copper and rust, revealing everything Silas had tried to hide from during the darkness. He hadn't slept. Couldn't. Every time his eyes closed, he saw children running through flames, heard screams that Daniel's words had planted in his imagination, like seeds of horror taking root. The woman in the cage was already awake, watching him with that same unwavering gaze. She'd probably been awake all night too, or maybe sleep was something she'd learned to do differently after witnessing what she'd witnessed, after surviving what should have killed her. Some transformations happened in fire. Others happened in cages. Silas stood, joints protesting, and walked to where he'd left his canteen. drank water that tasted like rust and regret. His reflection caught in the metal surface looked like a stranger's face lined and hollow, belonging to someone who'd made too many wrong choices and run out of chances to correct them. Daniel's revelations sat in his chest like a stone. They slaughtered her family to get her. The words wouldn't dissolve, wouldn't fade with daylight the way nightmares sometimes did. If anything, morning made them sharper, more real, impossible to dismiss as exaggeration or misunderstanding. He wanted to believe Daniel had lied, wanted to construct some narrative where Garrett and his men were brutal, but not monstrous, where the woman had been captured through violence, but not through massacre. But he'd seen enough of the world to recognize truth when it arrived wearing blood. The question Daniel left behind was simpler and more terrible than any Silas had faced before. Now that you know, what will you do? He approached the cage slowly, feet dragging through dust. She stood as he came closer, rising with the fluid grace of someone whose body had learned to move despite pain, despite exhaustion, despite everything that should have broken her. The morning light revealed details he'd missed yesterday. Bruises on her arms in the shape of fingers, burns on her wrists from rope that had been tied too tight for too long, and on her left hand a mark that made his stomach clench, a brand fresh and deliberate, the kind cattlemen used to mark ownership. They'd burned her, marked her like livestock, claimed her as property with heated iron and calculated cruelty. His voice came out rougher than he intended, scraped raw by shame. What Daniel said last night, about your family, about how they took you, is it true? Silence stretched between them, filled with birdsong and wind, and the weight of questions that couldn't be unasked. When she finally spoke, each word was measured, deliberate. Why do you ask, will it change anything? Fair question, brutal question, the kind that exposed the difference between curiosity and courage, between wanting to know and being willing to act on knowledge. I don't know. Maybe I just need to understand. Something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile, but close to acknowledgement. You want to know so you can decide if I deserve to be here, if my pain is enough to justify your guilt. The accuracy of it hit like a fist. Silas opened his mouth to deny it, to claim some higher motive, but the words died unspoken because she was right. He wanted absolution more than truth, wanted her story to either condemn her or redeem him, wanted the moral calculation to be simple enough that his choice became obvious. Yes, that's exactly what I want. At least honesty was something. At least he could offer that much. She studied him for a long moment, then moved to sit cross-legged in the center of the cage. The morning sun caught in her hair, turned it to obsidian, threaded with copper. When she began speaking, her voice carried the cadence of someone who'd told this story before, who'd rehearsed it in darkness, who needed to remember because forgetting would be the final death of everyone she'd lost. I will tell you, not because you deserve to know, but because someone should remember them. Someone other than me should carry their names. Silas sat facing her through iron bars that suddenly seemed obscene in their presumption, their assumption that some people belonged in cages while others held keys. 2 months ago, maybe less. Time moves differently now. We had a small camp in the Northern Territory, 20 families at most. We'd moved there after the soldiers pushed us from our traditional lands after the treaties were broken for the third time. The men had gone hunting. They'd be away for 3 days, maybe 4, tracking elk through the high country. Her hands moved as she spoke, gesturing to people and places that existed now only in memory. I was teaching 7 children how to weave fishing nets. Their mothers were preparing hides. The elders were telling stories. It was morning, beautiful morning, the kind where everything feels possible. The pause that followed stretched into something painful. Silas waited, not pushing, letting her find the path through what came next. They arrived on horses. 7 men, maybe 8. Price was leading them. They rode into camp shouting about missing horses, claiming we'd stolen from settlers 3 valleys over. Lies. We hadn't been near any settlements, but they wanted a reason to be there, wanted to justify what they had already decided to do. Her voice remained steady, but Silas heard the effort it took, the iron control required to speak past horror without drowning in it. At first, they just looked around, counting us, evaluating. Then they saw the children playing near the river. 7 children, youngest was maybe 5 years old. Nashoba was 8, brave boy. Always laughing, always finding joy even when there was no reason for it. The name hung in the air like smoke. Neshoba, a person not a statistic, a child with a name and a laugh and a future that got stolen. Price and his men started what they called playing, chasing the children, herding them like animals, making sport of their fear. The children were screaming, the mothers were begging, and these men were laughing. Laughing like it was entertainment, like terrorizing children was no different than a card game or a horse race. Silas felt something cold spreading through his chest, freezing his blood, turning his breath to ice. One of them, big man with yellow hair, he grabbed Neshoba by the hair, lifted him off his feet. The boy was crying, and this man was showing him off to his friends like a trophy, like proof of something. Her hands clenched into fists, knuckles white. I had a knife, only a knife. I told him to let the boy go. I begged. He laughed. So I cut him, slashed across his forearm deep enough to make him drop Neshoba. The boy ran. They all ran. I made sure they ran before the men could recover. She looked directly at Silas, eyes burning with something fierce and unrepentant. That is what I did. That is my crime. I defended children from men who thought terrorizing them was sport. I made them bleed. I made them feel fear, and I would do it again. I would do it 1,000 times. Price must have exploded with rage, must have screamed about unprovoked attacks, savage violence, the danger these people posed to civilization, must have ridden back to whatever settlement would listen and painted himself as victim rather than predator. The story would have spread like fire. Dangerous Apache woman attacked innocent men, needed to be captured for public safety. They came back 6 hours later, not just Price and his men. They brought soldiers, 20, maybe 30. They surrounded the camp before anyone knew they were there. Then they started shooting. Her voice finally cracked just slightly, just enough to reveal the wound beneath. The elders died first. They stood between the soldiers and the families, arms spread, trying to negotiate, trying to explain. They died talking. The mothers tried to shield the younger children. Most of them died too. I grabbed 3 children and ran. Kaya was one of them, 10 years old, fast runner, smart girl. Silas couldn't speak, couldn't move, could barely breathe past the horror of what she was describing. We ran for 2 days, no food, no water. The soldiers followed, always following. On the 2nd day, one of the children collapsed. Little boy named Hanovi. He couldn't go further. I tried to carry him, tried to keep moving, but he died in my arms that night. Thirst killed him. 5 years old, and he died because I couldn't find water fast enough. Tears tracked down her face, now silent and steady, but her voice remained level. The next morning, another child fell. Girl named Tayin, 7 years old, same thing, dehydration, heat, fear. I buried them both with my hands, no tools, just sand and stones and prayers. Kaya and I kept running. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, smearing dust and salt. On the 3rd day, we reached the foothills. Almost safe, but they caught us anyway. Garrett found us. He looked at Kaya and looked at me and made a calculation. He took me. Let Kaya go. Said one savage woman was enough, said a child wouldn't fetch good money. Something like relief flickered across her features. She ran. I screamed at her to run and not look back. I don't know if she made it to safety. I tell myself she did. I have to believe it or everything becomes unbearable. The silence that followed felt like standing in a graveyard. Silas couldn't look away from her face, couldn't unsee the grief carved into every line, couldn't unhear the names of the dead children she'd tried to save. They brought me here, not to jail, not to trial, here, to this cage, because Garrett had a better idea. He said I was worth more as a curiosity than as a prisoner. Said people would pay to see the savage warrior woman. Said my crime made me valuable. She stood, then walked to the bars, gripped them with hands that trembled slightly despite her control. Now you know. Now you understand. The children I saved died anyway. The children I couldn't save died worse, and I survived to be paraded in front of crowds who will never hear the truth, who will only see what Garrett wants them to see, a violent savage who attacked innocent men. Her eyes locked onto his. So tell me, Silas Crane, now that you know what they did, now that you know what they planned for me, will you still take their money? Will you still guard this cage? Before Silas could answer, before he could begin to process the magnitude of what she'd told him, her expression shifted. Became something almost gentle, almost curious. But you carry pain too. I see it in your eyes. I see it in the way you move, like a man who knows he's already dead but hasn't stopped walking yet. Tell me, what made you into this man? What broke you so completely that you take money to guard cages? The question was intimate and invasive and fair. She'd opened her wounds. Now she was asking him to open his. His throat felt tight. Words came slowly dragged from places he'd sealed off years ago. It doesn't matter. My story doesn't change anything. Her response was immediate, cutting through his deflection like a knife through cloth. It matters to you, and I have nothing but time. Tell me. So he did. Not because he owed her, though maybe he did. Not because telling would change anything, though maybe it would. He told her because she'd given him truth raw and terrible, and the least he could do was offer the same in return. 10 years ago, I had everything. A ranch, a wife named Margaret, a daughter named Emma, 6 years old, smart as hell, laughed like bells. The memories hurt worse than he'd expected, sharp and immediate despite the years. Margaret was good, best person I ever knew. She believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself. Made me promise right after we married that I'd never become like the men I'd fought alongside in the war. Men who survived by forgetting they were human. He pulled the leaf from his wallet, held it up so she could see how fragile it had become. Emma gave me this, said it was for good luck, said as long as I kept it, I'd stay brave and good. The leaf trembled in his fingers, threatening to crumble entirely. Then everything went to hell. Fire swept through one night, don't know how it started, lightning maybe, or sparks from the forge. Doesn't matter. By the time we woke, half the house was burning. I got Margaret and Emma out, but Margaret was hurt. Burns all down her side and back. Bad burns. His voice wanted to break, but he forced it steady. Doctor said she needed surgery. Special surgery in the city. Would cost $500, maybe more. I didn't have $500. Didn't have 50. So I borrowed it from the bank, but it wasn't enough. Never enough. He could see Margaret's face pale with pain, trying to smile when he visited her bedside. A man came to me, old army buddy, said he had work, escort job, transporting cargo across territory, would pay $600. More than enough to save Margaret. More than enough to start rebuilding. The shame of what came next sat in his chest like lead. I said yes, didn't ask enough questions, didn't want to know details because details complicated things, and I needed the money more than I needed clean hands. The job was supposed to take a week. I'd be back before Margaret needed the surgery. He closed his eyes, but that only made the memories sharper. 3 days in, I realized the cargo wasn't supplies, it was people. Women and children they'd captured from a raid, being transported to buyers in Mexico, slave trade dressed up as something else. The woman in the cage didn't move, didn't speak, just listened with complete attention. I tried to stop it, tried to free them, but I was one man against six. They beat me, took my horse, left me in the desert to die. By the time I walked back to civilization, 2 weeks had passed. 2 weeks. The next words felt like swallowing glass. Margaret died while I was gone. Died waiting for surgery I couldn't pay for because I'd chosen the wrong job, because I'd been too stupid or too desperate to ask the right questions. Emma was there when she passed. 8 years old, holding her mother's hand, watching her die because her father wasn't there. His hands were shaking now, trembling with old rage and older grief. Margaret's last words, the nurse told me later, were about me. She said, "Tell Silas I forgive him. Tell him he broke his promise, but I understand why. Tell him to be good anyway." That's what she said. She forgave me, even though I failed her in every way that mattered. The woman's expression had softened, but she didn't offer comfort. Just continued listening, bearing witness. Emma didn't forgive me. Couldn't. She went to live with her aunt. I tried to see her over the years, tried to explain. But she looked at me with eyes full of something worse than hate, disappointment. Last time we spoke, she was 18. She said, "You're not my father anymore. You're just a man who looks like him, a man who chose wrong when it mattered most." He tucked the leaf back into his wallet with trembling fingers. "Lost the ranch anyway. Couldn't keep up with payments. Lost in everything. Spent the next 10 years drifting, taking whatever work I could find, telling myself I was surviving when really I was just refusing to die. And now I'm here, guarding another cage, taking money to watch another prisoner, doing the same thing I swore I'd never do again. The confession left him hollow, scraped clean of everything except exhaustion. The woman considered him for a long moment, then spoke with unexpected gentleness. And now you do the same work again. You guard another cage. You take money from men who traffic in suffering. You become exactly what your wife feared you would become. He couldn't deny it, couldn't offer any defense that wouldn't sound like excuse. I told myself this was different, that you're just one person, that I can't save everyone. Her response was immediate, cutting through his rationalization like sunlight through fog. But you can save someone. You can save me. You can choose differently this time. You can be the man Margaret believed you were, the father Emma needed you to be. The words hit harder than any physical blow, because she wasn't begging, wasn't pleading for her freedom or appealing to his mercy. She was challenging him to be someone he'd thought was dead, calling forth a ghost of himself that might still exist somewhere beneath the layers of compromise and cowardice. Before he could respond, before he could begin to articulate the storm of conflict raging in his chest, the sound of approaching horses shattered the moment. Two riders appearing through the canyon passage, moving with the casual confidence of men who believed themselves untouchable. Price and Cole had returned early. Price dismounted with a grin that suggested satisfaction, like he'd accomplished something worth celebrating. Cole remained on his horse, watchful and silent, hand resting casually near his sidearm. The easy menace of professional violence. Price's voice boomed across the canyon, too loud for the enclosed space. Garrett wanted us to check on you, make sure everything's running smooth. No problems. Silas kept his voice neutral, professional, giving away nothing of the turmoil churning beneath. Everything's fine, quiet. Good, that's real good. Price walked toward the cage, studying the woman with the evaluating gaze of someone pricing merchandise. She met his eyes without flinching, without showing fear, and something in her defiance made Price's grin widen. She been giving you trouble, talking out of turn. She barely speaks. Smart, knows when to keep quiet. Price pulled a rolled paper from inside his vest, held it up like a trophy. Garrett wanted me to show you this. Figured you got a right to know what you're protecting. Make sure you understand the value of what's in that cage. He unrolled it slowly, deliberately, making a show of the reveal. The poster was larger than Silas expected, printed on thick paper with professional typesetting. Not some crude handbill, but a proper advertisement, the kind that suggested money and planning and networks that extended far beyond one man's ambition. The headline read, "Witness the Savage Apache Warrior Woman." Below that, smaller text painted a picture Silas knew was fiction, captured after a vicious, unprovoked attack on innocent settlers. A rare opportunity to observe primitive culture before it vanishes from history. Educational exhibit suitable for the whole family. But that was just the first page. Price unrolled further, revealing a detailed itinerary that made Silas's stomach clench. Week 1 through 4, Denver Exhibition Hall, with shows twice daily. Week 5 through 8, Chicago World's Fair annexation. Week 9 through 12, Philadelphia Natural History Museum. Week 13 through 16, New York Educational Spectacular. And finally, in bold letters at the bottom, permanent exhibit planned for the Smithsonian Institution, Washington, D.C. His vision tunneled darkness, creeping at the edges as the full scope of Garrett's plan crystallized. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't a quick profit scheme. This was systematic, long-term exploitation dressed up as education, as cultural preservation, as service to science and understanding. Price was still talking, his voice taking on the practice patter of a salesman. Got 3 other specimens already contracted. Your lady here will be the centerpiece, though, the main attraction. Garrett's got her story worked out perfectly. The savage who attacked brave settlers. The warrior woman too dangerous to be left free. People eat that shit up, pardon my language. He tapped the poster with one thick finger. Shows twice daily. She'll dance, demonstrate traditional customs, maybe do some fighting displays if we can train her properly. Admission is $2 per person. You know how much that is. That's fortune. Real fortune. Cole spoke for the first time, his voice flat and emotionless. Museum in Philadelphia already paid deposit, $500 just to guarantee her arrival. Garrett's sitting on contracts worth over 10,000 total. The numbers were obscene. Thousands of dollars generated by putting a human being on display, by charging crowds to gawk at suffering disguised as spectacle. $10,000 built on the foundation of murdered children and burned camps and trauma packaged as entertainment. Price leaned closer to the cage, his voice dropping to something almost intimate. You hear that, savage? You're going to be famous. People from all over the country will come see you. You'll be in newspapers, maybe even books. That's better than dying alone in the desert, right? That's a gift we're giving you. The woman's expression never changed. She looked at Price the way someone might look at a scorpion, dangerous, poisonous, but ultimately beneath contempt. Her silence was more damning than any words could have been. Price straightened, rolling the poster back up. Anyway, Garrett wanted you to see this, wanted you to understand what's at stake. She tries anything funny, you remember she's worth $500 in Denver. That's more than your cut for 3 days' work. Garrett's being generous, letting you in on this at all. They mounted their horses, preparing to leave. But Price paused, looking back at Silas with something that might have been concern or might have been warning. Don't let her get in your head, Crane. These Apache women, they're clever. They'll say things, make you feel things, turn your thoughts around until you forget what's real. Remember, she's cargo, valuable cargo, but cargo nonetheless. You're just here to keep the cage locked. Then they were gone, dust settling behind them like a curtain falling. Silas stood frozen, the poster's images burned into his mind. The woman in the cage had heard everything. Of course she had. Every word, every calculation, every reduction of her humanity to dollars and spectacle. When he finally turned to face her, she was standing at the bars again, and this time her control had cracked. Just slightly. Just enough to show the bottomless horror of understanding exactly what awaited her. 10 years, 5 cities, thousands of people paying to stare at me like I'm an animal in a zoo. That's my future. That's what your $200 purchased. Silas couldn't speak, couldn't defend himself or Garrett or the economics of cruelty that had brought them all to this moment. He could only stand there, the key to her cage, a burning weight in his pocket, and face the truth she'd been trying to tell him from the beginning. He'd become everything Margaret had feared, everything Emma had accused him of being. A man who chose money over morality, survival over soul comfort, over courage. And now, standing in this canyon with this woman and this choice, he had one final chance to be someone different. The sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the canyon walls in shades of amber and rust. Evening would bring darkness, and with it a long night, where Silas would have to decide if Daniel was right, if there was still time to choose differently, if redemption was something a man could earn through one right action after a lifetime of wrong ones. The woman watched him waiting, her eyes reflecting firelight as Silas built up the evening flames. And in that watching and that patient witnessing, she was offering him something he didn't deserve the chance to prove. He was more than the sum of his compromises, more than the man he'd become through years of choosing wrong. All he had to do was find the courage Margaret had believed he possessed. All he had to do was remember the promise he'd broken and decide if promises could be remade, if broken things could be repaired, if a man could become good again after forgetting how. The key in his pocket felt heavier with each passing moment, and the night was coming fast. Evening descended into night like a curtain falling on the final act of something inevitable. Silas sat by the fire he'd built, watching flames consume dry wood with the patient efficiency of time destroying everything it touched. The woman in the cage had finally taken more water, had eaten the dried meat he'd pushed through the bars without comment. Now she sat in a shadow, barely visible, a silhouette that might have been carved from the darkness itself. His decision was forming, crystallizing into certainty despite every rational argument against it. $200 meant survival. Meant keeping the ranch for maybe another month, buying time to find other work, maintaining the pretense that his life hadn't completely collapsed. But survival had become a hollow word, a justification for cowardice dressed up as pragmatism. Margaret's voice returned softer, this time almost gentle. She'd spoken these words on their wedding day, standing in evening light that turned her hair to copper. The measure of a man isn't what he does when the world is watching, it's what he does when no one would ever know. But someone would know. He would know. And that finally was enough. Silas stood joints protesting and walked to where his saddlebags lay against stone. He checked his revolver with hands that had steadied into calm. 6 bullets. Not enough to fight Garrett and his men if they all came at once, but enough to buy time. Enough to give her a chance. The woman must have sensed the shift in him, the change in the quality of his stillness. Her voice cut through the darkness, quiet but clear. You've decided something. Not a question. An observation. He crossed to the cage, pulled the key from his pocket, and held it up so firelight caught the metal. I'm going to let you go. She didn't move, didn't speak for a long moment. When her words came, they carried weight he hadn't expected. If you do this, they will kill you. Garrett will not forgive this, will not let it pass. Are you ready to die? The question deserved honesty, deserved more than platitudes about honor or redemption or doing the right thing. I've been dead for 10 years. Ever since I watched Margaret slip away because I wasn't there, wasn't fast enough, wasn't good enough. I've been walking around in a dead man's body going through motions that don't mean anything. At least this way dying will matter. At least this way I'll die as the man I used to be. He fitted the key into the lock. The mechanism turned with a click that sounded enormous in the desert silence. The chain rattled as it fell away. He pulled the door wide hinges, protesting with a sound that seemed far too loud, as if the canyon itself was objecting to this violation of the natural order. The woman stood slowly, cautiously, as if she didn't quite believe the cage was really open. She stepped through the doorway into freedom, and something in her posture changed. Not relief exactly, something fiercer, something that had been compressed and was now expanding back to its true shape. Silas moved quickly, gathering supplies. The spare canteen, most of the dried meat, a blanket, his backup knife. He loaded everything onto the better of the 2 horses the one Price and Cole had left tethered near the canyon entrance. There's a trail north, follows the ridgeline for about 5 miles, then splits. Take the eastern fork. It'll bring you to a river valley. From there you can lose yourself in the mountains. He handed her his spare revolver, the weight of it significant in ways that had nothing to do with metal and gunpowder. You've done this before, helping people run. Not a question. She saw through him with the clarity of someone who'd learned to read survival in other people's faces. Long time ago, before I decided survival mattered more than conscience, before I learned that helping people just meant failing them in more complicated ways. She checked the revolver with practiced hands, confirming it was loaded. The competence of the gesture told its own story about the life she'd lived, the skills she'd learned, the violence she'd already survived. And now you remember why you made that choice in the first place. Now you remember that dying for something is easier than living for nothing. Truth arrived in unexpected packages sometimes. Silas found himself almost smiling despite everything. Something like that. She moved toward the horse, then paused, turning back. In the firelight, her face had lost some of its hardness, revealed vulnerability she usually kept hidden beneath layers of necessary armor. My people have a belief that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. You have that courage, Silas Crane. That is worth more than any life lived in cowardice. Before he could respond, she did something that froze him in place. She removed the turquoise necklace from around her neck, the one piece of jewelry she'd managed to keep through capture and imprisonment, and held it out to him. This belonged to my grandmother. She said it protects those who have courage. You need it more than I do. The necklace felt warm in his palm, as if it carried heat from her skin, or perhaps from the faith her grandmother had invested in stone and silver. I can't accept this. Her response was immediate and final. You can. You must. If you survive what's coming, find the Valley of White Stones 3 days north. Ask for Kaya. Tell her Niall sent you. Tell her I am free because of you. Neil, a name finally. Not prisoner, not cargo, not savage. Niall, a woman with a name and a grandmother's necklace, and children she tried to save, and memories that would haunt her forever. She placed her hand briefly on his shoulder, the gesture carrying weight of ritual, of respect exchanged between equals. Then she mounted the horse with fluid grace and was gone, disappearing into darkness that swallowed sound and left only absence behind. Silas stood alone beside the empty cage, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had maybe 20 minutes before Garrett realized what was happening. 20 minutes to prepare for what came next. 20 minutes to make peace with the choice that would cost him everything. He reloaded his revolver with steady hands, checked his knife, found a position behind the largest boulder one that offered cover, while giving him clear sight lines to the main canyon entrance. He gathered what remained of the water, knowing that if this became a siege, every advantage would matter. The empty cage stood like an accusation in the firelight, and its doors swinging gently in the night breeze. Evidence of betrayal. Proof of the choice he'd made. Margaret's face surfaced in his mind one final time, but not dying, not pale with pain. He saw her on their wedding day, eyes bright with joy and certainty, believing in him with a faith that had turned out to be prophetic rather than mistaken. She'd known who he was beneath the compromises, had seen the man he could be even when he'd forgotten that man existed. Emma's voice followed, but not the bitter 18-year-old who'd disowned him. He heard her at 6 years old pressing that leaf into his palm. For good luck, Papa. For when you need it most. Maybe this was when he needed it most. Maybe this moment, standing alone in a canyon preparing to die for a stranger's freedom, was the culmination of everything that leaf had promised. Maybe luck wasn't about surviving. Maybe luck was about finding courage when it mattered. The 20 minutes felt like 20 seconds. Garrett and his men came fast and loud, abandoning any pretense of subtlety. They must have been closer than Silas realized, must have heard the horse, must have known immediately what his decision meant. Their shouts echoed off canyon walls as they rode in weapons already drawn, rage preceding them like a shockwave. Garrett's voice boomed across the space, raw with fury. "Crane, where is she?" Silas stepped out from behind the boulder, revolver raised, aiming at the center of Garrett's chest. The moment stretched thin, became sharp-edged and fragile. "Gone, and you're not getting her back." 3 men spread out, forming a semicircle, cutting off escape routes that didn't exist anyway. Garrett's face was twisted with something beyond simple anger. Betrayal, maybe? Or the rage of someone whose careful plans had been demolished by an unexpected variable. "You stupid, stupid man. Do you have any idea what you've done?" The question deserved an answer, deserved clarity about exactly what Silas had chosen and why. "I know exactly what I've done. I stopped you from destroying another life. Stopped you from putting a human being on display like she's some kind of exotic animal. Stopped you from profiting off trauma you helped create." Garrett laughed, a sound without humor, sharp as breaking glass. "Destroyed, I was saving her. She would have died in a week out there alone. No food, no water, no tribe to protect her. I gave her a future. I gave her purpose. She would have been remembered, studied, preserved for history, and you threw that away for what? Some misguided sense of nobility." The philosophy behind the cruelty was almost worse than the cruelty itself. Garrett genuinely believed his own justification, had convinced himself that exploitation was kindness, that caging was preservation, that profit and morality could coexist without contradiction. You were going to parade her in front of crowds, charge people money to gawk at her suffering. That's not preservation. That's torture dressed up as education. Garrett's expression shifted, became something colder, more calculating. "And what about your future? You just threw away $200, your ranch, your life, for what? For a savage who'd cut your throat if she had the chance." The word made Silas's finger tighten on the trigger, but he forced himself to breathe, to stay controlled. "Her name is Niel. She's not a savage. She's a woman who tried to save children from men like you. And she didn't cut my throat. She gave me something you'll never understand. She gave me back my soul." Price moved his hand toward his weapon, but Garrett held up a hand, stopping him. The older man was still calculating, still trying to find an angle, a way to salvage profit from catastrophe. "You think you're noble? You're not. You're a fool who doesn't understand how the world works. These people are dying, Crane. Their culture, their way of life, it's over, finished. In 50 years, there won't be any Apache left. What I do, what we do, we preserve them. We show the world who they were. We create memory." The argument was sophisticated, almost convincing, if you didn't look too closely at the bodies buried beneath its foundation. You don't preserve people by putting them in cages. You preserve them by letting them live free, by respecting their right to exist on their own terms, not as curiosities for your profit. Garrett's face hardened into something final. Freedom. There's no freedom for her kind anymore. There's only survival on our terms or death on theirs. I chose survival for her. You chose death. For both of you. He nodded to Price and Cole. The moment broke. Silas fired first, his bullet catching Price in the shoulder, spinning the man off his horse with a scream that echoed like tearing metal. Return fire exploded from multiple directions. Bullets ricocheted off stone with sounds like angry hornets, chips of rock exploding into shrapnel. Silas dove behind the boulder as rounds hammered into its face, each impact sending vibrations through stone into his bones. He fired twice more, forcing Garrett and Cole to take cover. 5 bullets left. Not enough. Never enough. But maybe enough to buy Neil the time she needed to disappear into darkness and distance. The canyon had become a killing ground, every shadow hiding potential death, every sound echoing and distorting until direction became meaningless. Cole was moving left, trying to flank through a narrow gap between boulders. Garrett advanced from the front, using the cage itself as cover. The irony would have been funny if Silas had energy left for humor. Price was down, but not dead, crawling toward his dropped rifle, leaving a trail of blood across dust. Silas aimed carefully and put a bullet into the dirt 6 inches from Price's hand. The message was clear. The wounded man stopped moving. 4 bullets left. Cole appeared at the edge of Silas's peripheral vision, pistol raised. Silas threw himself sideways as the shot rang out, felt the bullet pass close enough to stir his hair. He rolled, came up firing, and caught Cole in the leg. The man went down with a cursed weapon, skittering across stone. 3 bullets left. 2 men still standing. Mathematics of survival turning against him. Garrett had circled during the chaos, had found position that gave him clear angle on Silas's cover. The older man's aim was steady, professional, the calm of someone who'd done this before and knew how it ended. Last chance, Crane. Tell me which direction she went. Tell me now and I'll make this quick. Painless. You have my word. Silas laughed, a sound that surprised him with its genuineness. Your word, that's funny. Your word is worth exactly as much as your promises to preserve culture, which is to say nothing. He fired at Garrett's position, forcing the man back. 2 bullets left. The math was getting worse. Movement from the right. Cole had recovered his weapon despite his wounded leg, was aiming with gritted teeth determination. Silas swung his pistol around but knew he was too late, knew the angle was wrong, knew this was how it ended. The shot rang out. Silas waited for pain, for the impact that would finish everything. But nothing came. He was still breathing, still whole. Cole's weapon had misfired, or his aim had gone wide, or something had intervened between intention and execution. The universe had given Silas one more second, one more breath, one more chance. He didn't waste it. His bullet caught Cole in the chest center mass, and the man went down for good this time. The sound he made hitting stone was final, absolute. 1 bullet left. 1 enemy still standing. Garrett alone against Silas alone, and both of them knew how this arithmetic resolved. Garrett stepped out from cover, his revolver trained steady on Silas's chest. The older man's face had gone calm, almost peaceful. The rage burned away to leave something colder and more dangerous. You made your choice. Now live with the consequences. Or rather, don't. Silas raised his weapon, but his hands were shaking now from blood loss he hadn't noticed before. A bullet had grazed his left arm, shallow but bleeding freely, and the combination of adrenaline crash and shock was making his aim uncertain. 1 bullet, 1 chance, and his hands wouldn't stay steady. Garrett saw the weakness, smiled. Brave, stupid, but brave, I'll give you that much. He squeezed the trigger. The sound that followed wasn't a gunshot, it was thunder. Multiple horses, moving fast, accompanied by voices shouting commands in tones that carried authority older than money or cruelty or profit. This is Marshal Webb. Drop your weapons, all of you. 6 riders poured into the canyon, badges catching firelight, rifles trained on the scene with professional precision. Garrett froze, his weapon still pointed at Silas, but his certainty suddenly fractured. Price moaned from his position on the ground. Cole lay still, beyond caring about marshals or consequences. The lead rider dismounted with the controlled movement of someone who'd done this countless times. Marshal Webb looked to be in his 50s, weathered by years of pursuing justice through impossible terrain. His eyes swept the scene, cataloging details with the speed of long practice. The empty cage, the wounded men, the standoff frozen in its final moment. Garrett Hollis, been looking for you. Garrett's face went through rapid calculations, trying to find the angle that would save him. His voice, when it came, was smooth, reasonable, the voice of a businessman interrupted during legitimate enterprise. "Marshal, thank God you're here. This man Crane, he's a criminal. We hired him to guard a prisoner, and he let her escape. Stole one of our horses. When we tried to stop him, he opened fire. You can see the evidence. 2 of my men wounded, 1 possibly dead." Webb's expression didn't change. He stepped closer to Garrett, close enough that his next words were almost conversational. "That's so funny thing. I got a different story. Man named Daniel Washington rode into my camp 3 days ago. Told me about your operation. Trafficking, human cargo, plans to sell an Apache woman to exhibitions back east. Gave me names, dates, contracts. Everything I needed to build a case." The color drained from Garrett's face. Webb continued, his voice hardening. "Daniel said you might be using a canyon site for holding. Said I should check here. Said there might be a man named Crane who'd do something stupid. Looks like he was right on all counts." He gestured to his deputies. "Take Hollis and his men into custody. Charges are trafficking, kidnapping, attempted murder, and whatever else we find once we start digging." Garrett's carefully constructed facade cracked completely. "You can't do this. I have lawyers. I have connections. People in Denver who will vouch for me, who understand what I was trying to accomplish here." Webb's laugh was short and without humor. "People in Denver don't mean much out here. And trafficking is trafficking, no matter how you dress it up with talk of education and preservation. You are selling human beings for profit. That's the beginning and end of it." Deputies moved in, securing Garrett's weapon, pulling Price to his feet, checking Cole's body for signs of life they wouldn't find. The efficient brutality of law enforcement in action. Webb turned his attention to Silas, who'd lowered his revolver but remained standing through sheer will. "You Crane?" "Yes, sir. Daniel said you might do the right thing. Said you had that look. Men who've lost everything but might still have something left worth saving." He nodded toward the empty cage. "Where's the woman now?" Silas met his eyes, held them steady. "Gone. North. That's all I'll say." Webb studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Smart. Garrett would have sold her to exhibitions in Philadelphia and New York. We've been tracking his operation for 6 months. You did good work here tonight, even if your methods were questionable." One of the deputies brought medical supplies, began wrapping Silas's arm while asking questions about other injuries. The efficiency of it, the sudden transition from combat to bureaucracy, felt surreal. 10 minutes ago, he'd been dying. Now he was being bandaged by representatives of civilization, as if violence could be cleaned up and filed away that neatly. Garrett was being secured to his horse, hands bound, face twisted with rage that had nowhere left to go. As the deputies prepared to lead him away, he turned back to Silas, unable to resist one final word. "You think you won. You didn't win anything. That woman will be caught again. If not by me, by someone else. There are 100 men like me, 1,000. You can't stop all of us." The words hung in the air, ugly with truth. But Silas found he could answer with something approaching peace. "Maybe, but I can sleep at night now. Can you?" Garrett had no response to that. The deputies led him away, along with Price, who was cursing steadily, and Cole's body wrapped in canvas. The canyon emptied as quickly as it had filled, silence, rushing back to reclaim space briefly occupied by violence and justice. Webb lingered, studying Silas with expression that suggested he was reaching a decision. "What will you do now? Lost your ranch, I hear. Lost most everything." Silas shrugged, feeling the ache in his wounded arm. "Don't know. Figure that out tomorrow. Tonight I'm just grateful to be breathing." Webb pulled a card from his vest pocket, held it out. "I could use a man like you. Deputy position. Santa Fe District. Pays $50 a month. Not much, but it's honest work. More honest than guarding cages anyway." The offer surprised him, felt almost like validation. But Silas couldn't answer immediately, couldn't commit to a future when the present still felt uncertain. "I need to think about it." "Fair enough. Find me in Santa Fe when you're ready. If you're ready." Webb mounted his horse, then paused, looking back at the empty cage. "You did good tonight, Crane. Not many men would have made the choice you made. Not many men remember how to be decent once they've forgotten. Takes courage to find your way back." Then he too was gone, following his deputies and their prisoners through the narrow canyon passage. Silas stood alone in the space where so much had happened, where he'd faced himself and somehow survived the confrontation. Dawn was maybe 4 hours away. His arm throbbed, his body felt like one massive bruise. But he was alive, and Nasa was free. And for the first time in 10 years, the mathematics of his existence balanced towards something that might eventually resemble peace. He sat beside the fire which had burned low during the chaos, added wood, watched flames catch and grow. The turquoise necklace rested warm against his chest, tucked inside his shirt, where it couldn't be lost. Valley of White Stones, 3 days north. Ask for Kaya. Silas pulled the leaf from his wallet one more time. It was barely holding together now, more fragment than whole, but still recognizable as what Emma had intended, a promise of luck and goodness and courage. He'd kept it through everything, through all the years of forgetting who he was. Maybe it had worked after all. Maybe luck was just another word for grace, and grace was just another word for getting more chances than you deserved. The canyon walls stood eternal in darkness, indifferent to human drama. Stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. And Silas Crane, still breathing, despite everything, made another decision that would cost him comfort, but might save what remained of his soul. 3 days later, he stood at a crossroads where three trails diverged. One led back toward his former ranch, toward a life that no longer existed, toward trying to rebuild something already destroyed beyond repair. One led toward Santa Fe, toward Webster offer, toward honest work with a badge and regular pay in the security of structure. The third trail led north into territory he didn't know, toward a valley of white stones and a woman who'd given him her grandmother's necklace and a second chance at becoming someone worth being. The choice should have been easy. Practical considerations pointed clearly toward Santa Fe, toward the deputy position, toward stability and future, and the kind of sensible decisions responsible adults made. But Silas had spent 10 years making sensible decisions, choosing survival over significance, choosing safe over right. He turned his horse north. The journey took 4 days, not 3, because he got lost twice and had to backtrack. The terrain was unforgiving in all stone and steep climbs and narrow passages where one wrong step would mean broken bones or worse. But he kept moving, kept following the vague directions Neil had given him, kept trusting that she wouldn't have sent him somewhere impossible to find. On the fourth evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of amber and rust, he crested a ridge and saw it. A valley tucked between two peaks, its floor covered in white stones that gleamed like scattered pearls in the fading light. Smoke rose from several small structures built against the valley's far wall, barely visible unless you knew where to look. Warriors appeared from the rock's weapons, ready surrounding him before he could react. He raised his hand slowly, making no threatening moves. "I'm looking for Kaya. Neil sent me." The words felt inadequate, but they were all he had. The warriors studied him with suspicion earned through generations of broken promises and betrayal. One of them, an older man with scars crossing his face, stepped closer. "Neil is dead." The words hit like a physical blow. Silas felt the world tilt, felt hope drain away into certainty that he'd been too late, that Garrett had caught her after all, that his sacrifice had been for nothing. Then a voice cut through the darkness, sharp with life, and something that might have been joy. "No, I'm not." She stepped out from behind one of the structures, limping slightly, but whole, alive, free. Neil looked different without the cage around her, without the weight of captivity bending her spine. She stood straight, moved with authority, wore clothing that belonged to her culture rather than the torn rags Garrett had left her in. She crossed to where Silas sat, frozen on his horse, studying him with those same fierce eyes. "You're alive." He managed to find his voice. "Barely." Marshall showed up. "Garrett's in custody. Won't be trafficking anyone anymore." Something like relief flickered across her face, quickly controlled but visible. "Good. That's good." She reached up, touched the turquoise necklace he wore outside his shirt. "You kept it. You said it protects those with courage. Did it work?" Silas climbed down from his horse, feeling every bruise and ache from the fight 4 days past. "I'm here, so I guess it did." The older warrior approached, speaking in Apache to Naole. She responded in the same language, a rapid exchange that Silas couldn't follow. Then she turned back to him, speaking English again. "This is Dateste. He leads this community. He wants to know why you came, why you followed me here instead of taking the money you were offered." "Fair question. one that deserved a real answer, not platitudes about doing right or following conscience. Because I spent 10 years dying slowly, taking jobs I hated, becoming someone I despised. And when I let you out of that cage, I felt alive for the first time since my wife died. I felt like the man she believed I could be. I wanted to hold on to that feeling, see if it was real, see if I could be that man for more than one night. Datesti listened to Nail's translation, then studied Silas for a long moment. When he spoke, Nail translated his words. He says you are welcome here, for as long as you wish to stay. We need people who understand both worlds, people who can help us negotiate with traitors, warn us about dangers, teach our young ones what they need to know to survive in this new world. The offer stunned him. He'd expected maybe gratitude, maybe acknowledgement, but not this. Not belonging, not community, not purpose beyond simple survival. I don't know your language, don't know your customs. I'm just a failed rancher who finally made one good choice. Neil's smile was small but genuine. You are a man with honor who chose correctly when it mattered most. That's all we need. Everything else can be learned. Over the following months, Silas discovered that learning was easier than he'd expected. The language came slowly but steadily. The customs made sense once he understood the philosophy beneath them. And the work protecting this small community from men like Garrett, warning other Apache groups about trafficking operations, helping navigate the impossible space between cultures felt meaningful in ways his ranch never had. He and Neil worked together often, their partnership built on mutual respect rather than romance. She taught him about her culture, her history, the sophisticated society that existed before men like Garrett decided it needed to be preserved in cages. He taught her about the systems and structures of the world that was swallowing hers, about how to read legal documents and navigate bureaucracy and protect her people through knowledge rather than just resistance. They saved 4 more people over those months, intercepting trafficking operations before they could succeed. Small victories that wouldn't change the larger trajectory, but mattered absolutely to the individuals involved. Each rescue felt like paying down a debt, like balancing accounts that had been in deficit for too long. 6 months after that night in the canyon, a trader arrived with a letter. Silas recognized Emma's handwriting. Before he opened it, felt his hands start shaking as he broke the seal. Her words were careful, measured, but they carried weight he'd stopped hoping to feel. Father, I heard what you did. Heard you saved someone's life and nearly lost yours. Heard you chose differently than you chose with Mother. I've been angry at you for so long. So long I forgot what it was like to think of you as anything except the man who failed us. But now I'm hearing stories about you helping people, protecting them, being the kind of man Mother always said you were underneath everything. I'm not ready to see you yet. Maybe I'll never be ready, but I wanted you to know that I'm proud of you. Mother would be too. Maybe someday we can talk. Maybe someday I can learn to forgive the past by watching you build a better future. Maybe. Emma. Silas read the letter 3 times, tears tracking down his face that he didn't bother to wipe away. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something close. Something like hope wrapped in possibility. His daughter hadn't forgotten him completely, hadn't closed the door forever. Maybe someday meant more than never would have. That evening he sat with Neil and Kaya beside the fire. The girl had attached herself to Silas early on, following him around camp, asking endless questions, teaching him Apache words with the patient enthusiasm of childhood. She was 10 years old, one of the children Nail had saved, and she carried scars no child should have to bear. But she was alive. She was free, and that mattered more than all the philosophical arguments about preservation and culture and the inevitable march of progress. Kaya looked at him with serious eyes, asked him something in halting English. Silas, do you regret it? Losing everything? He pulled out his wallet, extracted what remained of the leaf Emma had given him. It was barely recognizable now, more dust than leaf, held together by memory, more than structure. But he also had the turquoise necklace warm against his skin, had this community that had become family, had work that meant something, had a letter from his daughter that proved redemption wasn't impossible, just difficult and slow, and earned through consistent choice rather than dramatic gesture. No, I don't regret it. For the first time in 10 years, I'm not just surviving, I'm living. Neil's smile was small but genuine, Above them, stars wheeled in patterns that had witnessed everything that would continue witnessing long after their small dramas faded into history. The fire crackled, the valley held its peace. And somewhere in the darkness, other people were making their own choices about who they wanted to be, whether they'd trade humanity for comfort or stand up when standing cost everything. Silas had made his choice, had paid its price, and discovered that freedom, real freedom, came not from having everything, but from choosing correctly when it mattered most. The price had been everything he owned. The reward was everything he'd lost: himself, his honor, his right to look in mirrors without flinching. Some prices were worth paying. He'd learned that lesson late, but he'd learned it thoroughly. And now, sitting beside this fire with these people who'd become family, he understood what Margaret had tried to tell him all those years ago. The measure of a man wasn't what he did when watched, but what he chose when no one would ever know. He'd chosen finally correctly, and that choice echoed forward into a future he couldn't predict, but no longer feared. The canyon was behind him. The cage stood empty, and Silas Crane, alive when he should have been dead, free when he should have been prisoner to his own compromises, finally understood what courage meant. Not the absence of fear, just the choice to act despite it. The choice to be good, even when being good cost everything. The choice to remember promises made to people who believed in you, even after you'd stopped believing in yourself. He'd kept the leaf, he'd kept the promise. And in keeping them, he'd found his way back from darkness into something that might eventually resemble light.